Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Don. Turned your camera off. Wow. I guess Don's not going to listen. But in any event, thank you very much. And brethren, thank you for taking time out to do this, although it's too hot to be outside tonight anyhow. So this is a good place to be, I hope. This is a little bit different from most of my presentations because it's as much of an advertisement as it is anything else. And so it's kind of like preaching to the choir tonight because by definition, the fact that you guys have attended this tells me that you're interested in education. But we all sometimes get a little stuck, maybe, and we say, "Oh well, I'm kind of tired of this, or I don't want to read this anymore, or study whatever." Or we're trying to convince another brother that in fact education is important. So maybe this will give you some tips for that, and or at least, if nothing else, a little boost for your own work. Because one of the things that has occurred to me as I've been studying is that Masonry essentially is about education and so on. And so let me do a screen share so you can see the rest of what's going on here, assuming I have permissions. Yes, I do. And there it is. And we'll get going with this. And again, it's kind of interesting having a professional here. Dan, I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but this is kind of my idea of education has changed a lot since I got out of school. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. But we start with this concept that says Masonry is a progressive science. And this is one of these common phrases we hear because this is in our ritual. We're told Masonry is a progressive science. And I think most people just let that slide and go, oh, well, that's nice. Of course it is. And okay, later on, we're told that we should make a daily advancement in Masonry. Well, what does that mean? And then, of course, in the fellowcraft charge, we're told that the more knowledge we have, the better off we're going to be in society. So it would seem to me that this concept of continual learning and the concept of learning in general is very important to the designers of Masonry. And in fact, considering that the Master Mason degree came much later in the development of Masonry, this actually could be said to be the prime idea of Masonry because the fellowcraft degree would have been the last degree you got. First, there was only one, then there was two, and the fellowcraft degree primarily is just school. It's all about education. So what do they mean by this? Progressive science is a great statement. So I thought, well, okay, let's go back and take a look at where these words come from. So the whole idea of progressive, we're kind of sandwiched here between the 14th and the 19th century. So that covers the development of Masonry pretty well. And it's the idea of progressing, moving forward, advancing, and so on. It's a concept of movement. It is not a concept of being still. It is not a concept of being set. So that's the first thing I want to put out. And then the second thing is I love the number two here, making use of or interested in new ideas, findings, or opportunities. Oh man, that's got Masonry written all over it. It's got the Enlightenment written all over it because that's where we came from. And that was one of their issues is new ideas, new findings, new opportunities, tossing off the old. And that should be something that we do. So this whole progressive thing is about movement, is about new things. Now, science is an interesting word because it wasn't around as long as you might think. In fact, what we call sciences like physics, chemistry, astronomy, things like that used to be referred to as natural philosophy way back in the day. But this word science is really about ignorance versus knowledge, right? And about a systemized kind of knowledge that we have. But again, the definition I think works the best for us as Masons is a system or method reconciling practical ends with scientific laws. Practical ends. In other words, you can't just study theory. There has to be an application of it for it to make any difference to you or to anyone else. And I'm still waiting for that application, for example, in the quantum fields, and it's getting closer and closer. I'm fascinated by that science, but I haven't figured out a way to apply it in my personal life yet, but perhaps someday I will. But the rest of this stuff, the stuff we talk about in Masonry, is all something that you can actually apply. So if we apply that concept, those definitions of progressive in science to Masonry, it tells me, and this again is just my opinion, tells me that Masonry is not a static set of laws or principles, nor should it be seen that way. It's a starting set of concepts that you need to work on. And that within the ritual, it always intimates that there's more there to learn. And I think we all know that. Hopefully, in your Masonic experience, and again, I'm preaching to the choir because of the type of people that are here. I don't know about you, but as I've listened to the same ritual over and over and over again for the last 26 years, 27 years, whatever, I hear something new every time, because I've changed and because the world has changed. And then some parts become more important than others. And the other issue is the issue of application, which I think is also stressed in Masonry in some very subtle ways, but in some very important ways, because it is through the application of these things that we're learning that we're actually going to grow as a person and become better, which is the ultimate outcome that we're looking for from Masonry. So of course I had to go back and look at some stuff, because you know me, I'm a history goof. So the first thing I wanted to pull out was Vitruvius. Now this, for a couple of reasons. One, I happen to be rereading the 10 books of architecture right now for another project. And it's essentially Fellowcraft 201, right? Because a lot of what we have in the Middle Chamber lecture and in the Fellowcraft degree was lifted directly from the 10 books of architecture. Obviously, these were written, as you can see, a long time ago. They were lost for a while and rediscovered in the 14th century by a very interesting character that we should talk about sometime, because he discovered some other documents that are important to us as Masons. But the founders of Masonry certainly would have been familiar with this book. And they obviously used it because, like I said, there's a lot of stuff in our ritual anyhow, the ritual that we use, the Preston Webb ritual, that was lifted almost word for word from this book. So you should really get a copy and read it. You can get it for free online. It's in the public domain, so you can get it from Gutenberg.org if you'd like, or spend 99 cents, get the Kindle version, which is good because the Kindle version, they actually translate the Greek, or you can spend less than 10 bucks and get a paperback. Okay, so back to Vitruvius. Why was he so cool? Well, he was the first guy to write down all the things you ever needed to know about architecture to do any sort of building whatsoever. So if it was a religious building or a public building or a private house or a theater, all of these things, he covered everything in just exquisite detail. Interestingly enough, without actually giving any numbers, because it's all about proportions and so on. But the part that's interesting to us is I think most interesting to us as Masons, yeah, I know we lifted the part about the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian directly from his book. You can go read that section. But it's this part about the education of an architect. Now, this is fairly early in history for people to be thinking about what makes someone an expert, what makes someone able to call themselves an architect. And to him, what was important was that you had to have a wide breadth of education. So not just only the things that we talk about in the Fellowcraft degree, but also things like history and drawing, or drafting as they would have called it back then. And all these things, the architect had to be well read on a lot of different subjects. And this is the first time we see this concept of theory and application, and how the two of them have to go together in order to have the ultimate outcome that you're looking for. So what did he talk about? He talked about how there's a lot of people that understand the theory of building, but have never actually done it. And they can't call themselves architects because they only know the theory. And there are people that can do it. They can lay a block wall, or they can raise a perpendicular and build a building, but they don't know why it works. They're just doing something by rote. And to him, you don't understand, and you don't really know, and you aren't complete until you get theory and application to come together. And that's something I think we need to emphasize a little bit more in our teachings, but it's right there in the ritual. Actually, it's right in there. It's just not as maybe in your face as we might wish, but theory and application are important. Of course, Socrates, the ultimate teacher, tells us these things, the only good is knowledge and the only evil is ignorance. So, obviously knowing something is very important. I like the last quote the best, because he says, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. And that's what I always hope to do when I do these presentations. I don't know if I always achieve that, but that's my goal, is to tell you something and make you think about it. So I want you to leave thinking, and that's what knowledge should do. That's what learning should be. Otherwise, it's just memorization. We can get parrots to do that sort of thing, right? So I actually, when I was in college, first semester, I had a young man in class that I knew that it was incredible. The man could ace any test on the planet, always pulled an A, hardly ever got him into the lab work though. couldn't apply any of this theory and actually do anything. It was horrendous. The man ended up flunking out because he couldn't apply anything he knew. So let's not be like that. Now we go to another Greek, of course, because I love my Greeks and Romans. This is actually Roman, Theophrastus, and Brother Deffenbaugh, apologize for butchering his name, but I'm not Greek. In any event, this is probably one of the coolest quotes about learning and the value of knowledge I've ever come across, and it has something really unique in it that I'm going to bring to you here in a second. So he says, the man of learning is the only person of the world who is neither a stranger when in a foreign land, nor friendless when he has lost his intimates and relatives. On the contrary, he is a citizen of every country and can fearlessly look down upon the troublesome accidents of fortune. Now that makes so much sense. In other words, let's see, how would we put this bluntly? The smarter you are, the better off you're going to be, kind of thing. But here's what's magic about this particular paragraph to me, and I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but I think as Masons, it's kind of a neat coincidence for us. In that first sentence where it says the man of learning is the only person, da 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 da, take out the word learning and insert the word masonry, and then read the paragraph again. So now it says the man of masonry is the only person of the world who is neither a stranger when in a foreign land, nor friendless when he has lost his intimates and relatives, on and on and on. And isn't that what we try and tell people about masonry? Is, oh, you'll always have a friend no matter where you're at. If you're in trouble or something's wrong, you can call on another Mason, hopefully, to help you, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting how those two concepts mirror each other, and it's about learning. And to me, masonry is about learning. And then, of course, Epicurus. And if you haven't studied Epicurean, I know everybody's into Stoicism right now, but Epicureanism gets a bad rap because everybody thinks they're the party boys, but they're not. And Epicurus had this interesting thing to say about the wise owe little to fortune. All that is greatest and essential is under the direction of the thinking power of the mind in the understanding. Again, what is Masonry trying to tell us all the time? Think, learn, apply, grow. This is an underlying concept that is very, very old, but they took into the concept of masonry very well. Now, one of the things that's weird about knowledge, though, is how dynamic it is and how changeable it is. So what I did is I thought it'd be kind of fun to put some stuff down that used to be, and we actually have books in the Grand Lodge Foundation library. They're old enough because they're from the 18th century and so on, that would actually uphold some of these things. Right. And if you go back far enough, the earth is the center of the universe. Well, the Roman church was pushed that for centuries. They even had a trial and got rid of Galileo and put him under house arrest for the rest of his life. It wasn't until the 1990s, actually, that they finally gave him a pardon and admitted that, in fact, the earth wasn't officially admitted that they were wrong. The earth isn't the center of the universe. There's quite a few years between the 1990s and Galileo's time, but that's what it was thought. Aristotle, if you ever read his book, Physics, wonderful philosopher, lousy scientist, he thought the reason why if you pick up a rock and you drop it, it falls down, he hadn't really figured out gravity, of course, yet, is because it wanted to be near its source. So the earth is the source of everything. So when you drop something, it tries to go back, and so on and so on. I like the one about turtles because there's this great joke about this woman being interviewed about this concept of turtles holding up the earth. And she was asked how many, and she said, well, it's turtles all the way down. And so think about that for a second. Unfortunately, this last one is still running around. There are still people that think the earth is flat. Why? Because they haven't learned, they haven't studied, they haven't taken the chance to educate themselves. And so too bad for them. So knowledge has a tendency to move around, but when it does that, then you can fall into what I call knowledge traps. Now, to me, these are the big four knowledge traps that happens to all of us. And you have to be on your guard when you're doing your research and you're educating yourself and you're learning about new things. You have to look out for these four things. The first is thinking that some piece of knowledge that you've gained is infallible. Now, I don't want to get into a discussion about the infallibility of scripture. That's different. That's a different discussion. That's a whole different issue. I'm talking about the infallibility of knowledge created by men for men. We all know stuff. Everybody knows that man can't fly, right? Whoops. Man will never be on the moon. Whoops. Okay, we did that too. Man, you can't do this, you can't do that. And all the time we keep overcoming that sort of stuff. So you need to keep that in mind. The part that goes with that, the infallibility part, is the part thinking that, well, now we know everything. Well, no, you don't. Uh, as it turns out, there's always more to know. Every time we think we know everything, you know, I mentioned earlier, I'm fascinated with quantum physics because it's one of those things that every time they think they've found the smallest particle or the minutest force that could possibly be in the structure of the universe, then somebody builds a new accelerator or they do a new experiment and all of a sudden we've got new particles. It's like, oh, shoot, now there's another new one. There was another new one here about a month ago that came out of some of the studies at the Large Hadron Collider. And it's like, whoops, now we got to add another particle to how we're built. So be careful about that. And then these last two, again, go hand in hand, and that is the failure to admit mistakes and let go of the past. Going back to the thing about, is the earth the center of the universe? I mean, this was the church's problem. It just absolutely could not give up the fact that all the data pointed to a heliocentric concept and not an earth-centric concept. And that caused a lot of problems. They lost a lot of ground. There was a lot of things. But this has happened with a lot of stuff. Because we become emotionally invested in our information sometimes, we don't like change. And the older we get, the harder it is to do that kind of change and so on. But these things have to be looked out for. And this has actually been one of our problems in Masonry. You know, people always say, oh, Masonry is, you know, this static thing that is perfect and so on. It is not. It has changed a lot over the century, the 300 years that we've had, 300 plus years that we've had it as an organized Grand Lodge type Masonry. One of the places you can see that is in Anderson's Constitution. So the Grand Lodge formed, they needed to have some sort of document to explain their mission and their background and so on. So they looked at Dr. Anderson and they said, hey, Doc, write us up a document. So he went and got all the old manuscripts he could find about Masonry, which was primarily, obviously, operative Masonry. And he wrote down a bunch of stuff and he produced this book, which was wildly successful. And they produced a second, that was in 1723 and 1738, they produced the second version, which was like 3 times the size of the first version because they'd thought of all kinds of other stuff they needed to tell us. Nonetheless, there's some things in there that are just plain wrong. For example, this concept that nothing can be ever changed in Masonry. That's not what the old manuscript said at all. What it says is nothing can be changed without the permission of, they wouldn't have had a Grand Master then because it was operative, but the master of the work. So you can't just change stuff on your own. It's got to go through a process. But he kind of skipped that part and just said, nope, nothing can be changed. And then this whole thing about ancient landmarks, we love to talk about this in Masonry. And it's one of the most confusing and misunderstood items, I think, everywhere because of Anderson. So he picked out what he thought were these landmarks of the craft by reading all these different things. But he never actually made a list and said, this is it. He just kind of mentions it here and there. If you look at the Nebraska Constitution for our Grand Lodge, it talks about the ancient landmarks, but it doesn't tell you what they are. And the reason why is nobody really can say what they are. I know of at least 12 different sets of ancient landmarks, and each one of them claims to be the most accurate, the most true set of landmarks. Most people typically go by the set that Mackey made up in the late 1800s when he was writing his encyclopedia, and he just picked those out of what he knew. So again, be careful. When you see stuff, you have to question it. A couple other things I wanted to bring up about Nebraska, about how Masonry can be struck, but also shows us how Masonry can get unstuck and actually fix its problems. We used to have this thing in Masonry, and not just in Nebraska, but everywhere, this doctrine of the perfect youth business. And that essentially said that you couldn't be a Mason if you didn't have all your bits and pieces. So if a man was missing a finger or an arm or a leg or an eye or couldn't hear or whatever physical disability he might have had, that somehow disqualified him to be a Mason. Now, this made perfect sense in the operative days because you're hefting heavy stones, you're building buildings. So you want everybody to start out as healthy as they can. You got less chance of further accidents on the site. And you probably know that, you know, let's think about it. Just out of experience, you'd know that if you stay at that job long enough, you're going to get a crushed hand or a crushed foot or lose a finger or something. So let's start out with the most we can. And that's great for operative Masons, but it has absolutely nothing to do with being a Mason in the speculative sense, in my opinion. Now, here's what happened though. That was a part of Masonry well into the 20th century. And you can go back into the proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Nebraska and read time after time after time where the Grand Master was either asked to come examine a man to see if he had enough parts to be a Mason, or was asked, hey, can we raise this guy? He's missing the little pinky on his right hand. And more often than not, if there was even the slightest bit of physical defect, so to speak, in a person, the Grand Master would say no. Now, fortunately, we've learned better. We don't do that anymore. And that shows me that, again, Masonry is not static. It's progressive. It learns from its mistakes and so on. We've had these same people, the same problem with indigenous people and people of color. The indigenous people is really kind of too bad, because as we moved west into the country, it turns out Masonry and indigenous culture are very, very much alike. And Masonry was very popular with the indigenous people, but not everybody felt that way. There's actually in our proceedings in the middle 1800s, a question was asked of the Grand Master to rule on if they could make this guy a Mason because he was half, and I'm quoting here, because he was, quote, half Indian. Now, interestingly enough, that particular Grand Master said, yes, of course you can. What's that got to do with anything? So he might have been the start of getting rid of that particular problem. We're all aware of the issue that we've had with people of color, primarily the Prince Hall question and so on. And then if you look through, again, Nebraska history and stuff, you'll notice that there's been various things that have come and gone about drinking, dancing, and swearing. The dancing one is still with us, however, in our bylaws. In fact, it is still quite illegal to have a lodge over a, quote, dance hall. And I don't think they mean, like where you take your grandkids or your kids to go learn how to, I think they had a different concept of dance hall. But anyhow, that's still actually in our stuff. So not being able to let go of the past or letting go of it too late or whatever, we've actually made some changes. And I'm proud to say that Masonry has corrected a lot of these goofy things that they've done in the past. They're embarrassing to read about, but at least we corrected it. But again, that helps me think that, in fact, we were meant to change and be progressive. So, okay, I've sold you on this concept. You need to go out there and learn some stuff, not just about Masonry, but maybe about a lot of things. I don't know. What's the problem with that? Well, back in the old days, especially for Masonry, prior to the internet, let's say, the problem was, how did you find this information? Well, it wasn't easily accessible. You had to buy physical books or hope your library had them. And that, buying the books was expensive, and most libraries didn't stock a lot of Masonic stuff. There were certain authors that predominated. There's a guy from the 50s, Voorhees, I think was his last name. He wrote some amazingly lousy stuff, but was considered to be this incredible author at the time. But when you read his stuff nowadays, you think, wow, not even close, buddy. They misquote primary documents. They don't use primary documents at all. They just kind of pull stuff out. It's very odd. So you would think, okay, well, it must be better now because we've got the internet and everything is available to us. But the problem for us now is this information overload. We went from not being able to get any information to having too darn much. So blogs and books and videos and online courses and websites and what do you do and where do you start? My email box every day gets assaulted by people trying to sell me some Masonic book or some Masonic course online or something that they claim is the best. And some of it is pretty good and some of it's pretty lousy, really. So that's a problem, especially for the new Mason. How do they know what to read and where to start? And more importantly, how do they know what not to read? I still have some books, over the 27 years I've been a Mason now, I collected a lot of books, and a lot of the books I collected in the beginning that were real popular Masonic books, I look back at them now and read them and go, wow, that was really not exactly what happened. It's kind of like when you take history in grade school, history in middle school, history in high school, history in college. You'll notice that a lot of things changed along the ways, and that our founding fathers, who we were told were these perfect paragons of morality and so on, had clay feet just like the rest of us. Well, that's what happens in Masonry too. You can find books that make us look incredibly good, but in fact, you need to read a little bit deeper and so on. So there's some issues with that. One thing I recommend is, Ben Franklin had this method in his biography. He talks about each month he was going to take a different concept, a different characteristic, and just work on that And not only that month, so maybe this month was charity and the next month was forgiveness, and maybe the next month after that was something else, and so on. And it sounds great. And then if you read the entire biography, though, by the time he gets to the end, he actually admits that he had a really hard time with this and it didn't work out as well as he thought it would. And I think he needs to give himself a break. Too late now, but should have given himself a break. He's human. It's hard to just keep the hammer down all the time, but it's an interesting way to do it. Focus on something smaller. Don't try to do everything at once. And then, of course, in Masonry, we have the issue of who is an authority. None of us are. I'm not. They just gave me a microphone tonight. So, you know, that's the best we can hope for. I mean, Albert Pike, even in Morals and Dogma, right in the front of it, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, "This is my opinion. You can accept or reject any of this that you want." So when people, especially non-Masons, say, "Oh, Albert Pike, he said this," or "Albert Pike said that," and he was the guy that controlled all Masonry, it's like, no, he wasn't. He was a guy. He was a popular author. He was a tremendous leader of Freemasonry, especially in the Scottish Rite, but he wasn't the only authority. And that's really hard to deal with. So you have to check, double check, and recheck. So let's look at how would we do this continuous learning thing if we're Masons? Well, one way, of course, is to ask a seasoned, I didn't want to say old because not all seasoned Masons are old, like myself, for example. I'm young. But ask a seasoned Mason for a suggestion. Now, you may get bad suggestions for that matter, but at least it's a place to start and it opens the dialogue. Look at what your Grand Lodge Education Committee has available for you. And in the chat box, I put the URL for our website. There's all kinds of stuff there. There's podcasts, there's printed stuff you can print out, stuff you can use in the lodge. We've been recommending books for years, although some of them I've had to go back, and I've had to go back and change some of the presentations too, as I've learned new things. So again, not saying they're authority, but it's as authoritative as we can be. We try to be very careful and curate our information very carefully to have a consistent message that we can back up and that we can prove. And as an aside, since I'm talking to the Scottish Rite tonight, if you're not a member of the Scottish Rite Research Society, what are you waiting for? They produce a book every year of some of the best, absolutely best Masonic research ever, and you get a quarterly newsletter as well, and it's really not that expensive. You know, split the cost with somebody else and share the book, or have you have the lodge do it as a lodge product. It's an amazing place to get that sort of thing. So be careful where you get your sources. Okay, pick a fundamental topic. So pick the topic of charity. I like to keep bringing that up because the word charity, as we think of it today, if I just walk down the street and say, "What do you think the word charity means?" The answer I get from 99.9% of the people is not what charity meant in the 1700s when Masonry was being developed. There's been a great change in how that word is used, and there's a great change in how that word was used from the Greek and Roman times, from the Greco-Roman times, even up to the 1700s and beyond. So pick something fundamental and go back and find original sources and see what people had to say about things. And just an aside here about original sources. The primary documents of Masonry are all pretty much available online by now. So there's several dozen manuscripts that are kind of the basis of what they started with and so on. Those are all available as scanned online. So when you read a book and some author, I don't care if it's Chris Hodapp or Bob Davis or any of these people that print a lot of books, and they say, well, it says this in this manuscript, or this person said this, don't take it at face value. Go back and get the primary document they're quoting and look it up and see if that's exactly what they said. And if that's how you think it should be interpreted, you get your own chance to reinterpret this stuff. Don't just let other people tell you what their interpretation is of what these things are. And like I said, that used to be almost impossible to do, but with the internet now, that's incredibly easy to do. There is no reason why you shouldn't go looking for primary documents, primary sources when you're reading someone's book or someone's paper or whatever about a particular subject. Like tonight, I invite you to go back and grab Vitruvius's book and read it and see what you think. I thought I was reading a Masonic book for the most part. There's great portions you can skip because you probably don't need to know how to lay brick or mix sand. But the parts about proportion and education and so on, amazing. Okay, share what you do with others because, again, you never know a subject as well as you should until you try to teach someone else. And I think Brother Deffenbaugh would probably agree with that. There's nothing like trying to explain to somebody else what you think you know about something to find out how much you do or don't actually know about it. And I support this Socrates Cafe concept, which we've talked about a little bit over the years. If you don't understand that concept, go Google Socrates Cafe, read the book, The 6 Questions of Socrates, take a look at this type of discussion group. It is amazing because you don't look for an answer in this. It's about sharing concepts and ideas, and nobody is right or wrong. You're just saying, this is how I feel about it, and let's examine things. And it's an amazing exchange if you can get one going. We actually, when we did this many years ago at the Midwest Conference in Omaha, there's actually a lodge in Indiana that was started after that conference because we exposed them to the Socrates Cafe thing, and that's what they primarily do in their lodge. I think it's important to challenge our beliefs. Probably because I'm a boomer, the whole question authority thing, from the 60s. But question your own authority. Sometimes we hold beliefs that were right when we were 22, but may not be right when we're 62. Things have changed. We've changed. Examine those beliefs. So look for new information about those beliefs and say, does this still match what I believe, or has something come to light that should make me change this? And not just your beliefs about Masonry, although I think that's incredibly important, because I've had to change just in the last year alone, actually. I've had a lot of change in how I feel or what I think about certain aspects of Masonry based on being exposed to some primary documents that I hadn't been exposed to before, and some sharing with a group that exposed me to these ideas. And I've had, it's all good. I mean, it's not like I've decided, oh, this is wrong, but you got to challenge those things and then restate those beliefs and say, okay, based on, I've looked at these, this is what I think. Now, you'll notice it says capture in a journal, review often. Anybody that knows me knows I'm probably the most techie guy on the planet. I think everything can be solved if we throw enough technology at it. However, one thing I have learned is study after study over the last decade or so has proven that when you physically write things down in a book, you learn them and remember them much better than if you type them in either on a typewriter, if you still have one of those, or into your word processor or whatever. But it's like, oh yeah, I'll just take notes on my phone, or I'll take notes on my iPad or whatever. And yeah, that's great if you don't have a piece of paper, but if you really want to learn something, you need to actually write it down. Journals are cheap, pencils are cheap, write it down, review it often, you're off and running. So why do we want to do this? So most of us, because we're curious. I think everybody should have the 2-year-old attitude. If you've ever been around a 2-year-old, what's their favorite word? Why? 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 Every time you run up against something, you should ask why. How does that work? How did that come to be, right? And it turns out there's a good reason for that. Again, multiple studies have shown that learning, lifelong learning of new skills, like say a new language or music, or in our case, memorizing ritual, those sorts of things, anything that's new and takes you out of your day-to-day form, sharpens your brain and helps you hold off those effects of the aging of your brain. And it's even been shown to hold off some of the effects of dementia and Alzheimer's, depending on how you do it. One of the studies I read, I was fascinated by because it said even as little as 30 minutes a day of reading would increase the sharpness of your brain, would give you these health benefits. Now, they're not talking 30 minutes of reading the newspaper and the box scores from last night's game. They're talking about reading something challenging and something that will make you think, okay? Because I think we can all read the newspaper without thinking too hard. So again, even just that little bit helps. So you get all these great health benefits, and there's benefits for your body, and there's benefits for your self-confidence, and so on. In the sidebar, I put a link to a Harvard Business Review article. And again, I apologize to our professional educator, but this is the United States of America, where cha-ching, the almighty dollar, seems to be more important than many things, unfortunately. And if for no other reason, there is a proven correlation between lifelong learning and greater economic outcomes, positive economic outcomes. And I was shocked by that, because at first I thought, oh, this is one of those things that we've talked about before, where correlation and causation are not necessarily equal. You have to be careful. Oh no, there actually is data going back as far as 2006 in this particular article that shows that the more learning, the better your economic outcome. So, you know, if I have to appeal to the basis of people, I will. I have no pride. I just want them to learn. And then the last thing, of course, is if for no other reason, Masonry tells us, right, we're supposed to be handing down this information from generation to generation to generation. That's how this information supposedly came to us, starting with Adam and working its way down and so on. Be a positive example. And by younger, again, I just mean your fellow crasher EAs, people that are just starting in Masonry. So those of us when I look at the group that's here tonight, most have been in Masonry for quite some time, pass that on. Try and show a positive example for other people. It's like, oh yeah, I've been reading this new book, or hey, you know, I never thought about, what do you think about this part in ritual? You know, I found out that what that is really referring to is blah, 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 blah. So be that positive example. And that again goes back into keeping you healthy. Being healthy generally means you get to live longer, which most people think is a pretty good deal. So what's our basic formula here? Learn. Continuously try learning something new, relearn things that you already knew. So you have to go back and check because again, things change. An example I like to use for this, if I'm giving this to a non-Masonic group. So I'm a boomer, and back in the day, we were told that an atom was this little lumpy thing of protons and neutrons that were stuck together, and they looked like little balls stuck together, and spinning around them in little orbits like planets were electrons. And so it was like a little solar system. And oh, by the way, the electron was the smallest possible particle in the universe. That hasn't been what's been taught about atoms for a lot of years. So if you're still sitting there thinking that atomic structure looks like that, you've missed out on a lot. Same thing for Masonry. If you're still concerned about, does he have a leg or a finger, or you know, any of these things that we used to believe that we've changed away from, make sure you're up to date on that sort of thing. So you have to relearn constantly and keep up with new things. Constantly try and stay away from this, what I like to call hardening of the attitude. Now, I stole that phrase from my wife's stress management class, but if you get to a point where you're no longer excited and you have no questions about Masonry, or you're bored by Masonry because you think there's nothing else to learn, check yourself. Something's wrong. That means your attitude has hardened up here. There's always something new to learn. There's always some new thing to do. And most important, as we've learned from back as far as, you know, 15 BCE, apply that knowledge till it becomes part of you and automatic, because having the theory, you can know everything there is to know about Masonry theoretically, but if you don't apply any of that stuff to your life, you're still not a Mason. That's why it's so sad that people think they're Masons when we give them, oh, look, here's your, we did the master's degree and here's your card. And they go, ooh, I'm a Mason. No, you're a beginner. Now prove to me that you are by doing the right thing and by living the things that we're trying to teach you. Don't just know them and be able to repeat them in lodge. Know how to use them. So I'm going to leave you with this last little thought here, because it's definitely time to be quiet and see what you guys think. I ran across this many years ago. It's a little Zen thing for those of you that are into Zen, but it makes so much sense. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. If you ever get to the point where there are only a few possibilities in Masonry left to you, you've got an expert's mind, probably not a good idea. Go back and find your beginner's mind. It's like a gate. When you start, the gate is wide open, but the more you know, the more that gate seems to close. Don't let that happen to you. For your health, for Masonry's health, and to actually be your best, which is what Masonry is trying to ask you to, trying to teach you to do, you need to keep up your learning. And guys, I'm going to leave a thank you there with you. There's my email address. If you have any comments that you'd like to share with me, or any questions or whatever, you can certainly use that email. I'm going to quit screen sharing, turn this back over to Don, and we'll see what kind of comments and questions